Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar entitled Envisioning Pennsylvania's Energy Future. My name is Sarah Jackson. I'm a Senior Associate at Synapse Energy Economics here in Cambridge, Mass., and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined for this webinar by three impressive experts who will be discussing the report that was just released by Synapse and EQ Research on behalf of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. First, we have Maya Van Rossum, who's the Delaware Riverkeeper herself. We also have Patrick Lukow, a Senior Associate here at Synapse. And finally, we have Justin Barnes, the Director of Research at EQ Research in North Carolina. They will spend about 30 minutes walking us through the new report, and then they'll take questions from the audience. I'm just going to walk us through some of the logistics for the webinar. We are recording this webinar, and it will be circulated afterwards to all the attendees along with the slides. The slides are, I believe, on our website, too, if anybody wants to follow along separately. To avoid any interruptions, we've actually muted everybody, and the lines will remain muted throughout the webinar. So if you want to ask questions, please send them in to webinar@synapse-energy.com, and we will be checking that email address for questions throughout. During the Q&A session, the panelists will answer questions that are sent in, so be sure to send those in. Again, that's webinar@synapse-energy.com. And if you're having any technical difficulties, like you can't hear the audio or the slides aren't advancing for you, then please feel free to use that chat feature in the WebEx software, and our webinar guru will try to help you out as best she can. So that's the logistics. I'm now going to turn it over to Maya.
Thank you so very much. This is Maya Van Rossum. I'm the Delaware Riverkeeper and head of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And I'm also joined on the line today by Tracy Carluccio, who is the Deputy Director of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. We're really excited that today has finally come and we can announce the completion and the release of this new report titled Envisioning Pennsylvania's Energy Future, Powering the Commonwealth's Energy Needs with 100% Renewables by 2050. On this webinar, you are going to hear from the experts responsible for this important and detailed analysis. The new report was conducted by the experts at Synapse Energy Economics and EQ Research, and the report lays out a roadmap that can guide Pennsylvania to be 100% supported by clean and renewable energy by the year 2050, and will allow the state of Pennsylvania to be well on its way to that goal by 2030, leaving fossil fuels totally behind. The Delaware Riverkeeper Network commissioned this report because, pursuant to the Clean Power Plan rules out of the Environmental Protection Agency, rather than be a true energy leader, Pennsylvania is poised to further its commitment to dirty fossil fuels, particularly through more fracking and drilling for gas. It's clear from the facts and from the science that this ongoing commitment to fracking is fueled by politics, not by genuine need. And this report makes very clear that there is, in fact, no genuine need for more drilling, fracking, and dirty fossil fuels. And through this report, we lay out a better path for the state of Pennsylvania. In addition to providing a roadmap for Pennsylvania, we believe this report and all of the detailed technical analysis and discussion it includes also offers a vision that other states can draw from in creating their own truly clean energy strategies and clean power plans. With that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Patrick Knight of Synapse Energy Economics.
Hi, Maya. Thanks. This is actually Patrick Lukow. Pat Knight also helped out with this report, but I will be presenting today from our end. I'll give a quick summary of what we do here at Synapse, and then I think I'll pass it over to Justin for an intro to EQ Research, and then we'll dive into the content of this presentation. So Synapse has been around for a couple decades now. We do electricity system analysis across the country, largely for public interest and government clients, looking at details of power system planning and how the electric power system operates, what power plants to build and retire, all sorts of fun things like that. You can find a number of our reports on our website. and today we're going to be talking about this analysis we did for running and developing a 100% renewable energy system for Pennsylvania. Justin, do you want to talk about EQ briefly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Patrick. So EQ was founded about 3.5 years ago. We're more or less kind of a policy shop, so we provide policy research, analysis, and incentives data based on a series of subscription services, as well as kind of customized consulting, focused primarily on clean energy, including distributed generation, as well as energy storage. So when we've got folks that have a long history of analyzing state clean energy policies on energy efficiency as well as renewable energy. Back to you.
Great, thanks. So I'll give a quick high-level summary of this report, and then we'll talk about a number of the details of what went into this analysis. And Justin, feel free to chime in if you have anything to add at particular points that even aren't your slides. So for this report, Envisioning Pennsylvania's Energy Future, we did a modeling and policy analysis out to 2050 to find one pathway to a zero CO2 emissions future, significantly more aggressive than the Clean Power Plan for the state. This report outlines a plan for a significant level of electrification, which is required for that zero emissions future, as well as substantial investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency, both on today's existing electric end uses as well as other sectors of the energy economy. This report has some specific suggestions about policy paths forward to meet these ambitious goals, and resulted in a number of really pretty impressive savings from what is a very substantial wholesale change of how energy is produced and used in the state. This scenario resulted in $134 billion of energy savings over the period 2015 to 2050, and $9 billion in electric and fuel cost savings in the last year of our study, 2050 alone. So there's a lot of gains to be had from this ambitious scenario. And all these changes result in a net increase of 500,000 job years over that period. So lots of jobs are created through the requirements of this ambitious scenario. So let's dive in. What does this mean? I'll actually start with some of the results of this scenario. What do CO2 emissions look like? This graph has 3 lines on it. In black on the left is the historical emissions in the state of Pennsylvania. In gray is a status quo, business as usual scenario, assuming existing policies are held constant going forward. And then in red is our zero emissions scenario, which declines to zero emissions by 2050. You can see in both the reference case and the policy case here, emissions decline to 25% below peak levels by shortly after 2020. And this is largely a result of a decrease in coal generation in the state and the already existing shift towards natural gas. But after that, our policy scenario shows a very dramatic change. Emissions reach 50% below the peak emissions levels in the mid-2030s, and by 2050, the Pennsylvania emissions inventory reaches zero emissions for the state as a whole. So how do we get there? We've used 4 significant strategies to reduce emissions of CO2 in the state to zero. One of them is electric energy efficiency. So we substantially decrease the load on the power system, the load from existing uses of electricity on the power system through largely economical energy efficiency measures. We've created a scenario where Pennsylvania reaches the energy efficiency goals of leading states in the country. The second plank is electrification. So residential, commercial, and industrial uses are almost entirely electrified to reduce emissions from the point of use. The third is a dramatic build-out of in-state renewable energy, mostly wind and solar. And then the last is incentivizing renewable energy in the states that surround Pennsylvania. Justin, do you want to talk about the current landscape?
Sure, thanks, Pat. So now that Pat has laid out where we're trying to get to, and in very broad terms, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the kind of current energy use landscape and policy landscape is, and what those goals actually mean for with respect to Pennsylvania's policies right now. So starting off with that first component, energy efficiency. The central policy that Pennsylvania has right now supporting energy efficiency is the State Energy Efficiency Resource Standard, which goes by another name in Pennsylvania, but it is what it is. And that Energy Efficiency Resource Standard is accounted for in the reference or hypothetical kind of status quo scenario for energy efficiency that Patrick laid out. And what would be required to get to the ultimate energy efficiency target is about 2.5 times the amount of efficiency included in the reference scenario. So it's a fairly considerable increase. With respect to renewable energy, as many of you know, or probably know, Pennsylvania has an existing alternative energy portfolio standard that goes out through 2021. One of the kind of more significant characteristics of that standard is that it identifies as alternative energy a whole series of resources like waste coal and a few others that don't really meet the definition of renewable energy as it's traditionally defined, or as how we define it. And so what that amounts to is that if you were to compare that 100% target to the resources, the traditionally identified renewable energy resources within the standard in 2014, those traditional renewable energy resources made up about 3.2% of retail electric sales. And so that means that 100% means more or less, or about 33 times the 2014 percentage of actual sales provided by renewable energy in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania also has some fairly good policies supporting distributed generation, principally net metering, good grades, net metering and interconnection under the Free to Grid publication. So those are supporting things like rooftop solar PV. Next slide, please. So moving on to transportation electrification, I want to draw folks' attention to first off to the graphic in the bottom left-hand corner. So that's what that graphic is showing is non-electric energy use in Pennsylvania, and you can see that transportation makes up 43% of that. So it's the single largest contributor to non-electric energy use in Pennsylvania right now. And if you go up to the top graphic, you can see the various sources of transportation fuels in Pennsylvania. And way there at the bottom, you'll see retail electricity sales, which is practically non-existent as a form of energy for transportation right now. So from an energy use standpoint, we're basically starting from scratch in Pennsylvania. And similarly, from a kind of regulatory or policy standpoint, we're also more or less starting from scratch. You've got some kind of indirect regulations and incentives via vehicle emission standards, as well as some minor alternative fuels incentives type programs, but none of those are really kind of targeted specifically at transportation electrification. So the impact I think they're currently having is kind of incidental and indirect. So moving on to end use electrification, right now in terms of policy support, there is some indirect support via the Energy Efficiency Resource Standard and kind of the accompanying incentive programs that are offered. That is, there are incentive programs for that support, residential and commercial installations of electric heat pumps. So there's some indirect support right now, but it's not really targeted at electrification per se. It's targeted at energy efficiency. And that also creates kind of a counterproductive effect where there are some incentives that are actually supporting the continued use of fossil fueled heating. So kind of continuing to maintain that infrastructure rather than stimulating a transformation to a fully electric future. So that's more or less where we stand right now. Patrick, you want to take over?
Sure, thanks. So to talk about energy efficiency in a little more detail, where we go from here, this shows sales of electricity to current uses in the reference case, the policy case, and we also added a line for a zero energy efficiency case. So there are, as Justin mentioned, some energy efficiency measures in the baseline that do serve to keep load below where it would otherwise be. And these are purely existing programs, but what we've done in the policy case is add a significant level of energy efficiency at current uses along the lines of the levels that leading states like Massachusetts and California are currently hitting. So these aren't totally unrealistic levels of energy efficiency. They're very achievable, but it does represent a significant shift from where the state has been in the past. And these measures end up reducing sales to existing end uses by 14 points as compared to the reference case, which can make a significant difference when we're talking about other measures of electrification that will increase the overall sales in the state quite substantially. Justin, do you want to talk a little bit more about energy efficiency?
Sure. So as Patrick mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, one of the more significant components of or significant policies for achieving the types of targets that we're envisioning is a more ambitious energy efficiency resource standard. And that's more ambitious in terms of target setting, but also broadened to include all of Pennsylvania utilities, because currently right now the ERS doesn't cover all utilities in the state. So it covers most of the major ones, but there are some smaller co-ops and I believe a few smaller investor-owned utilities that are not subject to the standard right now. So that's one of the principal changes. Another one is updated building codes. More recent versions of the International Energy Conservation Code are progressively more efficient than old versions. Pennsylvania has currently adopted the 2009 IECC, or equivalent with, I believe, some variations. There's a 2015 code, which is substantially more efficient than the 2009 code. Beyond that, in terms of building codes, there are opportunities to adopt things like solar-ready building standards, where you've got building codes that make sure a rooftop is capable of supporting the installation of a PV system, having some of the electric or plumbing infrastructure already, within a new building, so, ultimately reducing the cost of installing solar at a later date. There are certainly some other policy mechanisms that can be used, developing appliance standards for things that are not covered by federal appliance efficiency standards right now. Facilitating things, for instance, like property assessed clean energy, which I believe there's a bill at the Pennsylvania legislature just for that right now. But really, financing programs that could include PACE, could include on-bill financing, things that help defray that initial upfront cost of higher efficient equipment and allow more consumers to pursue energy efficiency. Also, building energy disclosure, that's, kind of accomplishing two things. One, it's making building owners and occupiers more aware of how much energy they're using and where that energy is being used. And it's also making potential buyers of those properties more aware of what the ongoing energy costs are going to be, and ultimately, that lets them kind of assess the value of one building over another based on its energy efficiency, and presumably, is going to help support, better sales of buildings that are more efficient. Next slide, please. So getting beyond that, you know, there are definitely also, I mean, we're talking about electric energy efficiency. Certainly electric industry policies can play a very prominent role in that. You know, part of that is incentivizing end users through electric rates to use energy more efficiently. So, you know, things like inclining block rates where you've got multiple tiers of rates and the higher tiers are priced higher, meaning that when you save energy, you're kind of offsetting or you're saving you're saving more money and you're paying less for your remaining energy than you would otherwise. Reduced or eliminated fixed charges being you know, those portions of your electric bill that you can't change with energy efficiency because they're fixed on a monthly or a daily basis. You know, those are things that have been used prominently in a lot of other states to support energy efficiency. But what's also critical in this is kind of securing and incentivizing, securing the cooperation of electric utilities in supporting energy efficiency, you know, and looking at them as collaborators rather than having them potentially be kind of obstructionist or at least not particularly cooperative. So there are several different elements to that. One of the principal ones is decoupling, and the term decoupling usually refers to decoupling utility revenue from sales, that is eliminating what's usually referred to as the throughput incentives, where utilities are incented to sell more electricity because they make more money when they sell more electricity. That can be coupled with things like performance-based rate making, which performance-based rate making in itself is not, you know, necessarily supportive of energy efficiency, but it can be designed to support energy efficiency. One of the examples of that could be that, you know, allowing a utility to earn a relatively higher return or providing, you know, some form of bonus incentive if they meet or exceed the energy efficiency targets by a certain amount. Patrick?
Thanks. So talking about electrifying end uses, reducing emissions from the electric sector as it stands today is, I don't want to say easy, but we know how to do it. It's somewhat straightforward. A significant portion of the emissions in the state of Pennsylvania, however, come from other end uses where fossil fuels are used on site. So as Justin talked about, transportation represents a large fraction of that, and then industrial, commercial, and residential sectors all use fossil fuels on site. This chart shows the energy consumption in those 4 sectors in 3 historical years, and then for both the reference and policy case going forward after that. You can see it declines pretty rapidly, even in 2020, to meet these very ambitious targets. We have a significant electrification of all of these end uses, which is why in the policy case, the non-electric energy consumption falls off towards 2050. You'll see a little slice of industrial non-electric energy consumption in 2050 still, and this represents on-site consumption of renewable fuels. And the reference case, as opposed to the policy case, largely continues in a BAU-like world where we continue using energy much like it's used today in all of these sectors. Before I go on, I just want to remind everyone, please send your questions to webinar@synapseenergy.com. We've already seemed to have quite a few coming in, and we'll start getting to them pretty shortly. To give a little more detail on that electrification, this table just shows the fraction of each sector and measure that is electrified in each of the coming decades. And you can see this is quite a rapid pace. Even with electric vehicles as they exist today, it will take some ambitious measures to get to 33% of motor gasoline-powered vehicles by 2030. But it's achievable. That technology exists. And this is something we can do, and coupled with greening of the power sector itself, this will significantly reduce emissions from vehicles and these other sectors that you see here by 2030, 2040, and ultimately to zero by 2050. There's a number of policy tools to get to that, and I'll let Justin talk about those in a little more detail.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. So as we've indicated, from a transportation electrification standpoint, we're largely starting from scratch in pretty much all respects. And, you know, that creates a lot of opportunities, being that we don't have, you know, some of the same existing incentives and things of that nature that exist for, say, supporting energy efficiency. So a few of those things that you're going to see on the left side of the page are, you know, very kind of traditional market transformation type tools, you know, providing folks with a direct incentive to pursue one end or another, in this case, transportation electrification, buying electric vehicles. So things like tax credits and exemptions, grants, loans, and rebates, you know, revisions to say, existing taxes that make purchasing electricity for vehicle use more attractive than purchasing gasoline for vehicle use. But they're also supplemented by things like convenience incentives that for vehicle electrification can be pretty important and useful during early years. So things like letting electric vehicle owners use high occupancy vehicle lanes, providing public EV parking spaces, providing free parking for electric vehicle owners. Those things ultimately kind of become unsustainable when you get to high percentages of folks that already have electrified vehicles, because everybody can't use a high occupancy vehicle lane. You can't have free parking everywhere. So when you're kind of getting beyond that, you're thinking about other things. And, well, I forgot to mention, it's pretty critical, at least in the early years and then going forward, that the infrastructure for EV charging be sufficient to support a large number of electric vehicle owners. And that can be accomplished in a variety of ways. I mean, you can have things like incentives that support the installation of EV charging equipment. You can go a step further into kind of the more regulatory arena and, you know, say, require employers or universities, malls, other public spaces to have EV charging infrastructure installed and available. You can make that infrastructure convenient to use by, you know, say, making sure that if somebody is going to pay for charging in a mall, that they're able to do it in the form of a credit card, things of that nature. Beyond that, I think you're thinking about, you know, the integration of electric vehicles into the grid. You know, being able to use the inherent storage capacity of electric vehicles to support renewable energy integration, grid modernization, you know, using rate design to support incentives for customers to purchase electric vehicles, things like EV-specific rates, time of use rates that permit off-peak charging, development of building codes, that is kind of a broader expansion of building out the infrastructure to, say, you know, require fast DC chargers eventually in all residential homes or in all commercial buildings, as well as potentially easing permitting processes. And those are the kinds of things that you're kind of tackling in a lot of ways the mass market, principally the light duty vehicle market, at least at first with those, things like personal vehicles, conveyances. When you get to heavy duty vehicles and marine and air and rail transport, so talking principally freight, so semis, shipping, that sort of thing, it's pretty clear that there is the need for some technological advancement there for those semis that need to drive long distances without charging and carry heavy loads. So, you know, in the long term, there's a need for technological advancements. In the near term, you can accomplish something with electrification by providing avenues for auxiliary electric use in places like rest stops or gas stations or at marine terminals or at airports. Next slide, please. So moving on to end-use electrification. As you can see on the left side of the page, the principal components in the residential and commercial sector are space heating and water heating. And we have, you know, pretty clearly available commercially available solutions for electrifying space heating and water heating in commercial and residential buildings. What's kind of critical, and as I mentioned before, is eliminating some of those policy mechanisms, or at least refining them, refining the ears, so that you don't have conflicts, and so that they're really oriented around, both energy efficiency and on promoting electrification. And along the same lines, aligning tax policies in a similar way also to support electrification rather than fossil fuel purchases, things like sales taxes. Getting beyond that, there's clearly kind of a balance that needs to be accomplished in the form of electric rate making. You can devise electric rates that support electrification, just kind of superficially. Lower electric rates support electrification because people, it makes electricity, that much more competitive relative to other fuels. But at the same time, doing so, you're maybe diminishing the energy conservation incentive in some respects. So there's definitely a need for balance in terms of electric rate making policy for energy efficiency and electrification. If you're moving down to some of the kind of more recalcitrant or more difficult uses to electrify, they primarily occupy the industrial sector, high temperature process heating, that sort of thing. And while there are some commercially available solutions for things like steel making out of recycled steel, electric arc furnaces are used for that. Not all process heating really has a very viable electrified solution at this point. Ultimately what you're trying to get to is direct electrification or the substitution of combusted electrolytic hydrogen, that is hydrogen that's burned, hydrogen that is also sourced from electricity produced by renewable energy. But ultimately, it's pretty clear that there needs to be a direct effort to find solutions for some of those kind of more difficult electrification sectors going forward. Patrick?
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means for the power sector, both in Pennsylvania and the rest of the region a little bit. The 100% renewable energy case has a significant renewable portfolio standard that encourages a very substantial expansion of in-state wind and solar. We get in 2050 about 70 gigawatts of in-state solar is built, coupled with about 10 gigawatts of wind power, largely onshore wind, I believe. And you can compare that to a reference case if you look in this figure, which has a significant expansion of natural gas capacity as coal and nuclear power retires. So these are very different futures. Both show a expansion of generating capacity in the state, but it's a very different type of expansion. Then in our reference case, many new gas power plants get built as a result of low-cost gas in the state, both to supply in-state load and to export to Pennsylvania's neighbors. In the policy case, due to this policy that we've envisioned, no new gas gets built other than the currently planned power plants. And we meet the declining production from coal and nuclear with wind and solar, and we also use those resources to meet the significantly increased electric needs of the state as a result of the electrification that Justin was just talking about. And these are all resources that can be built. They're a small subset of the total technical potential in the state, as I'll show a little bit later. But this is a very significant expansion. 70 gigawatts of solar is more solar than exists in the country today. So it will be a project. This is the land requirements of all those resources. The large green circle is the land area in the state of Pennsylvania as a whole, and the circles next to each of these labels represent the area consumed by the different resources. So onshore wind is a very tiny little circle, not much area will be required. Onshore wind produces significantly more energy per unit of capacity than utility PV, so the land requirements are a little bit less. But we also have more utility PV than onshore winds being built in these scenarios. Rooftop PV is also a great resource that has minimal incremental land requirements, but we're not building DG PV on all the rooftops in the state. There's still some additional capacity there as well. So we think this scenario presents a tractable, doable future that meets all the constraints of a 100% renewable scenario, but also the renewable resource potential in the state, as well as the surrounding regions of Pennsylvania. We've leveraged data sets developed by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, who's done a very significant amount of research on resource potentials for these different resources all across the country. Justin, do you want to talk about how we do that expansion?
Sure. So as you saw on the last slide, what we've got for getting to 100% is a combination of what's principally going to be customer-sited rooftop PV, grid supply, that's wind farms and solar farms, and then the balance being accomplished through the purchase of RECs within the Pennsylvania region, within the PJM region. Starting off with kind of that in-state development, I think what it really comes down to is planning, and it's planning at a variety of different levels. It's planning at the electric utility level, improvements in interconnection standards, kind of the ability to actually interconnect all of that distributed PV, the ability to interconnect all of that, all of those grid supply resources, and do so in an efficient way. It's planning and permitting at the local level, whether it's permitting for the small rooftop systems or for the larger grid supply systems. There's definitely a need for planning, and there's a need for a kind of balance to be maintained between making processes more efficient and more transparent, but retaining the significant retaining the reasons why you have permitting rules in the first place, which is protecting local resources, protecting the grid, that sort of thing. So definitely planning and balance need to be maintained. Finally, you've got planning of the electric grid itself to accommodate what, by all respects, is a much larger, is a huge amount of renewable energy within the state. Accompanying that, you're thinking about, especially in the long term, really the elimination of embedded fossil fuel subsidies, preferences that really make fossil fuels themselves look more attractive in a financial sense than they actually happen to be. So billions of dollars in incentives that are kind of embedded within the tax code that go towards fossil fuels in Pennsylvania currently, eliminating those. And finally, kind of similarly to energy efficiency, there is the ability through rate making policy to make distributed generation more or less attractive. And really, making it the most attractive is adopting rates similar to what you would also adopt to support energy efficiency. Now, the reason why we used kind of this regional REC approach is there are several reasons for it. One, it's simply, it adds flexibility to a standard. It's actually kind of the way Pennsylvania's standard is developed right now. It avoids some kind of legal complexities and risks that are associated with, trying to mandate in-state resources. And ultimately, it's still a tide that raises all ships within the region, because even though, you have RECs coming from out-of-state facilities, you're taking those RECs off the market so that they can't be used in other state standards, and so securing more development on a region-wide basis as well. And I think it's also useful to think about it from a from a job standpoint. Yeah, it's true that while if you're building resources that are used to supply RECs to Pennsylvania and other states, you know, Pennsylvania is maybe missing out on some of the economic activity associated with that construction. But, you know, in setting a 100% renewable energy target, you're kind of effectively making Pennsylvania a central nexus, you know, with a far more ambitious standard than anywhere else in the region. And, you know, even though there are folks developing projects in different states, you know, they may have headquarters in Pennsylvania, you know, they're located in Pennsylvania because it's the central point. And, you know, they're paying taxes, they're working there, and sure, they're working in other states as well, but they're providing a lot of benefits to Pennsylvania simply because they've chosen to locate kind of their primary place of business in Pennsylvania rather than the surrounding states. And that's, you know, really kind of attributable to Pennsylvania being, quote unquote, you know, a center for renewable energy development in the region in a way that's more ambitious than what's been adopted in other states. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to either Patrick or Jenny, and we're going to questions.
Thanks. This is actually Sarah. I'm going to take over this slide. So this slide presents all the contact info for your great presenters here and a couple of the other folks who contributed to the report. I am now going to start to go through questions, and we've had a lot of questions. Continue to send them, but if we don't get to your question today, if we run out of time, we're going to try to follow up with you since we have them by email. So don't despair if we don't get to your question right now. And I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask a quick question because I think it will help answer a number of questions that we've had, and that is, in the report, you guys do a great job in the executive summary at the beginning of summarizing the way you focused this study and how you were looking at this from an energy consumption in Pennsylvania perspective. So there have been a number of questions about, you know, why didn't you consider methane emissions or why didn't you consider other types of emissions? So maybe you could just go through and explain how you looked at it, what resources were considered, and what resources are explicitly not part of the study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can take a first stab at that, and then Justin, if you want to chime in, that would be helpful. I think we tried to find a reasonable middle ground of what level of consumption and generation would result in a zero emissions inventory consistent with how many states do their CO2 emissions inventories. So generation that is attributable to customers in the state of Pennsylvania, those emissions are attributable to the state of Pennsylvania as well. Generation that might be produced in the state of Pennsylvania but exported to a neighboring state would presumably be included in that neighboring state's emissions inventory. Anything else you want to add, Justin?
No, unless there are, I guess, maybe additional nuances or follow-ups.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've had a couple of questions about what would it take to generate it all in state. I know you guys didn't look at that, and so I think that's not necessarily a question for this webinar, but it's certainly something on people's minds, so maybe for a future time we can look at that. So the next question is, I think, somewhat related, but it says, in your policy scenario, Pennsylvania becomes a significant net importer of electricity when it has traditionally been a large exporter. Why does this happen, and do you see it as a reasonable future pathway?
Yeah, that's a result of finding a low-cost, feasible way to meet this scenario. So a lot of that exported energy in the future in the reference case is a continuation of producing frack natural gas in the state and building new gas power plants to send that electricity to neighboring states and the PJM region as a whole. And there are significant environmental concerns with something like that. This scenario, the policy scenario that we built, leverages both the existing renewable resource potential in the state as well as the renewable resources of neighboring states. And I think that's something you have to do if you're building a single state aggressive policy like this or a more regional or national level policy. You want to use the lowest cost, best performing resources you can. We've built this extensive system of power interconnects all across the country, and we might as well leverage that to make such a transformation of the power system in a way that doesn't increase the bills you have to pay to the electric company every day.
Thank you, Patrick. I think that that brought up another question that I've seen a couple times, which is, and I think the answer is no, but you guys didn't in this assessment look at how the electric system would be able to function under this new high renewable scenario in terms of reliability and the things that transmission organizations are concerned about. That wasn't a part of this study, right? Yeah,
I can talk about that briefly. So we didn't just come up with these numbers based on our expert judgment. It's in the report, but we used an electricity system model called REEDS, developed by NREL, which matches supply with demand in a series of time periods in every year going forward, and chooses the most economic and best performing resources depending on all these different constraints. It's not an hour-by-hour chronological model, which you might use if you're just doing a 1 or 2 or 5 year study out into the future. There's a little less resolution, so you wouldn't use this if you were doing purely a reliability study, but we think it gives us a good level of confidence that this world that we've developed is something that will function and meet the constraints of the power system in the future.
Yeah, and I would add to that if you look at how much DG, rooftop PV we modeled, we're not really talking about anything that's much beyond, where Hawaii is right now in terms of rooftop PV. So, yes, Hawaii has some fairly significant issues associated with its distribution grid right now, but it's also, a little bit more unique in the sense that it's composed of a whole series of islands, each of which are relatively isolated. And it's also, something we're planning this out through 2050, so there's ample time to, get this grid modernization and get the technical solutions that may be necessary to support that kind of level of distributed generation in place. We're not talking about tens of thousands of megawatts of rooftop PV tomorrow. Right.
Thanks. And one follow-up question related to transmission. I think this is for you, Patrick. This is about REEDS. So that model does use some generic transmission. So you have some ideas of transmission, but nothing like an RTO would do. But you do have the idea that transmission might be needed for certain things, and so that it's not ignored in this.
Yep.
Is that right?
And the model will build new high voltage DC or AC transmission lines if it makes more sense to do that. It doesn't do a distribution level study to address the issues that Justin was just talking about.
Okay. And you had a slide that showed land estimates, like land use estimates for the different types of technologies. Do those include transmission needs and sort of supporting infrastructure needs?
I'm not sure. I don't think those were included in those.
So we also had a couple of questions, and now I can't remember which slide it was on, but there was the slide that showed the way the resources moved down, and a few people were curious about the treatment of nuclear in the study because it looked like nuclear disappeared in both the reference case and the policy case going forward. Could you talk a little bit about why that happens?
Yeah, we just made the blanket assumption that nuclear plants receive one license extension, and so they reach a 60-year lifetime and then they retire. And that was the same policy assumption in both the reference and the policy case. The model could, if it wanted to, have built new nuclear power, but it chose instead to largely build new wind and solar.
Great. So I have a question that may be for Justin, and that is, we were talking about transportation and transportation policies. is there anything that you could tell us that we might learn from California's cap-and-trade program that includes, I know that program includes transportation fuels. Is there anything we might be able to glean from that program here in Pennsylvania?
To tell you the truth, I'm not all that familiar with California's cap-and-trade program, and we didn't really look at cap-and-trade as kind of the chosen vehicle for creating an electrified transportation system. We looked at more of kind of the lower level facilitating policies rather than what amounts to kind of a very high level policy statement. So we didn't. So like I said, I'm not that familiar with California's program, and we didn't kind of use it as a policy option.
Okay, fair enough. So we also had a couple of questions about people who were a little concerned about the political landscape in Pennsylvania, and I know that that wasn't necessarily a part of this, but there was a question about what you think the lower hanging fruit are in terms of policies that you guys raised that you found in this report. Do you have any ideas on sort of the political angle on that?
I defer to you, Justin, or maybe Maya.
Yeah. I think you can find places, particularly as supports for in-state renewable generation, that aren't necessarily as vulnerable to a politicized environment. That is kind of good utility distribution planning and good interconnection procedures are not necessarily political third rails. They're largely kind of technical issues that experts can get together, and if they can't reach agreement on everything, they can reach agreement on a lot of things that could be considered improvements in the way things are right now.
And this is Tracy Carluccio from Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I can add a little bit to that. There is a movement amongst legislators in Pennsylvania, for instance, to not have as many incentives in place for natural gas. It's very expensive and has cost the state a lot of money. So some of the built-in ways that the playing field is just not even between natural gas and renewables are embedded in programs that the state administers. And it's really a matter of getting out of that some of the built-in natural gas bias. Like, for instance, the Pennsylvania Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard. Its goal is based on putting clean energy in place, and yet there are dirty energy alternatives such as biomass and coal bed methane and waste coal and municipal solid waste, that sort of thing, in that portfolio standard, with a real effort on the part of communities and different constituents, such as the renewable energy movement, as well as environmental and conservation and environmental justice communities. We'd be able to move forward with changing that standard to really be based on clean energy. There's other ways that the system that administers for instance, energy efficiency and conservation under Pennsylvania's Energy Efficiency and Conservation Program could, without a lot of work, be switched to really pay attention to putting energy efficiency in place instead of implementing the present Public Utility Commission fuel switching working group's recommendations, which are emphasize switching to natural gas instead of energy efficiency and conservation. So some of these existing programs, which actually, in their mission have some very good goals built in, have been sort of captured by the natural gas industry in recent years, and really without a lot of work or even political change, because there is interest across the Commonwealth now, and it's growing, in putting a more economically and sustainable energy system in place, that we feel that we might be able to get some some real support towards moving towards renewables and away from natural gas as the path that Pennsylvania is choosing. So it's not an easy path, but it actually could be low-hanging fruit because a lot of these policies are already in place. It's just a matter of switching how they're implemented.
Thanks, Tracy. And I think many folks in Synapse would point out that there are states around the country already coming pretty close to achieving the energy efficiency, the levels of energy efficiency that are called for in this report by much later on. So we know it's possible. So another set of common questions is around battery storage. And so I was wondering if you guys could talk a bit about how or if you modeled battery storage in this report, how you're thinking about it as a technology. Are you assuming it is going to improve, or are you kind of looking at current levels of technology and how they might be used?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can take that one. So there is a little bit of battery storage that gets built in the scenario, but largely the model didn't see too much of it as necessary because we have the wider PJM grid in general. So the Pennsylvania power system can exchange power with states in the region on a very real-time basis that allows it to balance these variable renewable resources. But I think Justin mentioned this during the presentation, that we also have a significant electrification of transportation, and there's a good likelihood that all of those batteries in the vehicles all across the state could also be leveraged by utilities in the state to help balance the needs of the grid.
Well, yeah, not only batteries that are actually in use in electric vehicles, but potentially retired EV batteries becoming stationary, cost-effective stationary storage.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. And I am going to have to choose. There are a lot. So I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question again. We'll try to follow up with you after the webinar. Pennsylvania continues to produce some generation with natural gas, even in your policy case. Doesn't this mean this is not a zero emissions future?
I'd just like to chime in here. We don't consider that there's room for any sort of trade-off to allow natural gas to continue. The amount that's shown as still remaining is from existing plants, and this plan is based on no new fossil plants being built starting today. And we absolutely are wedded to the concept of not having any natural gas or coal, any fossil fuels, be involved in meeting our energy needs, and that's what this Pennsylvania 100% renewable plan does. It shows how to get there. The amount of gas that's shown in that graph is actually going out of state. And as was explained so well by our experts, this report is based on us meeting 100% renewable in the electricity that's consumed in state. So the electricity that goes out of state through the development of natural gas plants is not controlled by this plan. As a matter of fact, we feel here at Delaware Riverkeeper Network it is absolutely essential that we understand that any clean power plan, any renewable plan is not going to stop fracking or coal mining in Pennsylvania. That is a separate effort that we all need to work on, and Delaware Riverkeeper Network is committed to making sure that the development of natural gas, when we don't need it anymore in state, is going to be stopped. And we think the movement towards renewables will help us get a ban on fracking and on the end of coal mining in the state of Pennsylvania. Of course, the PJM grid it continues to use a lot of natural gas. And if you look at the graph in the report, it shows that there's a much larger amount of natural gas being used generated and used in the PJM grid. We've got to stop that too. We believe that Pennsylvania will become a model here, and by becoming 100% renewable, not needing and proving we do not need fossil fuels in order to meet our energy needs in state, and by demanding renewables from out of state in order to meet the needs and not building any new fossil plants within Pennsylvania to generate electricity for Pennsylvanians, we believe we're starting us on a strong path towards eliminating fracking, which we believe, and we know that all the science shows, is devastating our communities where it is occurring, as well as coal mining.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks Tracy, that was great. We're at the end of our hour, so I know there were still a lot of questions out there. Please feel free to contact anyone here on the contact sheet or to reach out to us. We're going to do our best to follow up with people who sent in questions, but if you don't end up hearing from us, please feel free to send them again and we'll try to help you out. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and this has been the webinar on Envisioning Pennsylvania's Energy Future.